Abraham's story is one of faith, obedience, and divine promise. It is a journey that spans generations, shaping not only the history of Israel, but also the foundation of three major world religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. His name is synonymous with trust in God, a trust that was tested and strengthened through trials, covenants, and blessings beyond human comprehension. But before he was known as Abraham, the father of nations, he was Abram, a man living in Ur of the Chaldeans, surrounded by a culture steeped in idolatry and polytheism. He was not yet a patriarch, nor did he yet carry the divine promise that would make his name great. He was simply a man called by God, chosen to step into a destiny far beyond his understanding. His journey was not an easy one. He faced famine, war, personal failures, and the deepest tests of faith imaginable. Yet through it all, he remained a model of what it means to believe, even when the fulfillment of God's promises seemed impossible. Abraham's life is more than just an ancient story. It is a testimony of God's faithfulness and the power of trust. His story reminds us that faith is not just about belief, but about action. It is about stepping out when the road ahead is unclear, trusting in the unseen, and holding on to promises that seem too good to be true. Before we dive into the details of his life, let us take a moment to consider what faith truly means. Faith is not merely an intellectual acceptance of God's existence. It is a deep-rooted confidence in his character, his promises, and his plans. Hebrews 11 verse 1 defines faith as the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Abraham embodied this faith. He walked into the unknown, trusting in a voice that called him to leave behind everything he had ever known. Imagine for a moment the difficulty of such a decision. Abram was not a young man when God first called him. He was 75 years old. At an age when most would seek stability and comfort, he was asked to leave his homeland, his relatives, and his father's house to embark on a journey with no clear destination. Genesis 12 verse 1 records God's command: "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." It was a call to absolute trust. God did not give him a detailed plan, only a promise. The journey ahead was filled with uncertainty, but the voice of God was enough for Abram to take his first step. Throughout history, many have been called by God to step out in faith, but few have been called to carry a promise as vast and consequential as Abraham's. God's covenant with him was not just about his personal destiny. It was about the destiny of an entire people, an entire world. Through him, all nations would be blessed. This is why Abraham's story remains relevant to us today. It is a story that transcends time, offering lessons on trust, obedience, patience, and divine faithfulness. It reminds us that God's promises are not always fulfilled in our timeline, but they are always fulfilled. As we embark on this journey through Abraham's life, we will explore the pivotal moments that defined his faith. We will see how he wrestled with fear and doubt, how he experienced moments of weakness, and how, despite his imperfections, he remained a vessel for God's plan. The story of Abraham is not just his own. It is the story of God's relationship with humanity. It is the story of a divine promise that echoes through history, from the ancient past to the present day. Before we begin, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving a comment. It really helps support the channel and allows us to bring more content like this to you. Now, let's dive into the story of Abraham, the father of nations. A call from the heavens. In the ancient world, where people lived under the rule of mighty kingdoms and worshipped many gods, one man was chosen to change the course of history. His name was Abram. He lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, a prosperous city known for its wealth, trade, and advanced civilization. Yet, Despite the abundance of earthly riches, Abraham was destined for something far greater. His story begins with a divine call, one that required complete faith, obedience, and a willingness to leave everything behind. The book of Genesis tells us that God spoke to Abraham, commanding him to leave his country, his people, and his father's household, and to go to a land that he would show him. This was no small request. In ancient times, family and land were everything. To leave one's homeland meant leaving behind security, inheritance, and the familiar comforts of life. Yet, the promise that accompanied this call was extraordinary. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 12 verse 2-3. This promise held incredible weight. Not only did God assure Abraham of personal blessings, but he also declared that through Abraham, the entire world would be blessed. It was a covenant that would echo through generations, shaping the very foundation of faith for countless believers. But faith is never without trials. To follow God's call, Abraham had to leave everything behind: his home, his relatives, and even the gods that his ancestors worshipped. The journey ahead was filled with uncertainty, and the road to Canaan was long and arduous. Yet, despite the unknown, Abraham obeyed. Imagine the scene: a man in his 70s, gathering his household, his flocks, and his belongings, setting out into the wilderness with nothing but a promise. Many would have doubted, hesitated, or even refused. But Abraham walked forward, trusting in the voice that called him. This journey was not just a physical relocation, but a spiritual transformation. It was the first step toward becoming Abraham, the father of nations. But before that transformation could be completed, Abraham would face trials that tested his faith, moments of doubt, and lessons in trust. The land of Canaan was his destination, but the journey of faith had only just begun. Between fear and faith, Egypt, and the test of trust, Abraham had taken a bold step of faith by leaving his homeland and following God's call to Canaan. He had obeyed without hesitation, trusting in the promise of a great nation, yet the journey was not without challenges. Faith is often tested in unexpected ways, and for Abraham, the first major trial came in the form of famine. The land that was supposed to be his inheritance, the very place God had led him to, was struck by a severe shortage of food. This was no small difficulty. In ancient times, a famine could mean devastation, loss, and even death. For Abraham, who had left behind stability and wealth in Ur, this moment must have been deeply unsettling. Faced with the harsh reality of hunger, Abraham made a decision: he would go to Egypt. Egypt, with its abundant resources and powerful civilization, seemed like the logical choice. The Nile River ensured fertile land and food supply, making it a safe haven during times of scarcity. However, nowhere in the biblical account does it say that Abraham sought God's direction before making this move. This omission is significant. Up until this point, Abraham had followed God's voice, but now, in a moment of crisis, he relied on his own reasoning. As Abraham and his household approached Egypt, another fear took hold of him, one that had nothing to do with famine. His wife, Sarai, was beautiful, and he feared that the Egyptians would kill him to take her for themselves. This fear led him to devise a plan. "Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." Genesis 12 verse 13. Abraham's request was not entirely false. Sarai was, in fact, his half-sister, sharing the same father but a different mother. However, the intent behind his words was deceptive. Instead of trusting in God's protection, Abraham relied on half-truths and human schemes to safeguard his own life. As they entered Egypt, just as Abram had predicted, Sarai's beauty caught the attention of Pharaoh's officials, and she was taken into Pharaoh's palace. In return, Abram was treated well. He received livestock, servants, and wealth. On the surface, his plan seemed to be working. He had avoided immediate danger and had even gained material prosperity. But at what cost? Sarai was now in Pharaoh's household, separated from her husband, placed in a situation that could have led to moral and spiritual compromise. Abram's fear-driven decision had created a crisis far greater than the one he had originally tried to avoid. But even in human failure, God's faithfulness remains. The Lord intervened. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife, Sarai. Genesis 12, verse 17. Pharaoh, unaware of the deception, was struck by divine judgment. The affliction was severe enough that he realized something was terribly wrong. When he discovered the truth that Sarai was Abram's wife, he confronted Abram with indignation. "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Genesis 12, verse 18 to 19. Abram, the man chosen by God, had been rebuked by a pagan ruler. It was a humbling moment. Pharaoh, who had every right to punish Abram, instead simply ordered him to leave Egypt. And so, with Sarai by his side once more, Abram departed, taking his household and all the wealth he had acquired. This episode in Abram's life is a powerful lesson on the nature of faith and fear. Even the strongest believers can falter, allowing anxiety to overshadow trust in God. Abram had feared for his life, but he had forgotten the one who had called him, the one who had promised to bless and protect him. Yet, despite Abram's failure, God remained faithful. He did not abandon Abram to the consequences of his mistake. He intervened, rescued Sarai, and ensured that Abram's journey toward his divine destiny continued. As Abram left Egypt and returned to Canaan, this experience must have lingered in his heart. He had seen firsthand the dangers of relying on human wisdom over divine guidance. It was a lesson he would carry with him, a reminder that faith is not merely about hearing God's call, but trusting him even in the most uncertain moments. Abram's journey was far from over. The promises made to him were still unfolding, and ahead lay an even greater revelation, a covenant that would shape the course of history. The covenant of the stars, a promise beyond measure. Abram had returned from Egypt, humbled yet blessed, and settled again in the land of Canaan. His flocks had grown, his household had expanded, and his wealth had increased. Yet, despite all that he had gained, one thing remained missing: a child. Then, one night, God spoke to him again. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." Genesis 15, verse 1. It was a reassurance of divine protection and provision. But Abram, though faithful, could not hide his concern any longer. "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus?" Genesis 15, verse 2. Abram's words carried both sorrow and practicality. In the absence of an heir, his inheritance would go to his servant, a common practice in ancient times. He had followed God, he had trusted in the promise, yet from a human perspective, the promise seemed impossible to fulfill. But God's plans are never limited by human circumstances. "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." Genesis 15, verse 4. Then God led Abram outside. Beneath the vast night sky, free from city lights, a display of stars stretched beyond the horizon. Abram gazed upward, the cool air surrounding him, the silence of the desert amplifying the moment. And then came the words that would define history. Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Genesis 15 verse 5. It was an unfathomable promise. Abram, an old man with a barren wife, was being told that his descendants would be as countless as the stars in the heavens. From a human standpoint, it defied all logic. But faith is not built on human understanding. It is built on trust in the one who speaks. And Abram believed. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Genesis 15 verse 6. This moment was monumental. Abram's belief was not just an acknowledgement of God's words. It was a deep, unwavering trust in the divine promise, despite every visible contradiction. And that faith was counted as righteousness, not his works, not his deeds, but his faith. This was the foundation of a covenant that would shape generations to come. But God did not stop there. He established the covenant through an ancient and sacred ritual. In those times, when two parties made a covenant, they would cut animals in half and walk between them as a sign of commitment, signifying that if either broke the agreement, they would suffer the same fate as the slain animals. God instructed Abram to prepare such a sacrifice, cutting a heifer, a goat, and a ram in half, along with a dove and a pigeon. As Abram waited, a deep and terrifying darkness fell over him. Then, in a vision, God spoke, revealing that Abram's descendants would be strangers in a land not their own, enslaved for 400 years, but that they would be delivered with great possessions. And then, something extraordinary happened. Instead of both parties walking between the sacrifices, only God, represented by a smoking firepot and a blazing torch, passed through. This signified that the covenant was entirely dependent on God's faithfulness, not Abram's. It was an unconditional promise. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates, Genesis 15 verse 18. This was the sealing of a divine agreement. The land, the people, the future, it was all secured by God's own word. But if faith is about trust, it is also about patience. And though the promise was given, its fulfillment would not come immediately. Abram and Sarai would still have to wait. And as time continued to pass, their faith would once again be tested. A child of doubt, Ishmael, and the price of impatience. The promise had been given. God had spoken. Abram would have descendants as numerous as the stars, and through him, a great nation would be established. But the years continued to pass, and Sarai remained barren. The waiting became unbearable, the silence of God stretching longer than they had expected. Sarai, once full of hope, now wrestled with disappointment. She had always known her body was beyond the years of childbearing. And though the promise had been spoken to Abram, she saw no evidence that she would be the one to bear the child. Perhaps, she thought, she was not meant to be part of this promise. Perhaps God intended for Abram to have children, but not through her. In those days, it was customary for a woman who could not bear children to offer her servant as a surrogate. If the servant bore a child, it would be legally considered the child of the wife. It was a human solution to a divine problem, a way to take control when waiting became too difficult. Sarai, desperate to see the promise fulfilled, made a decision. The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Genesis 16 verse 2. It was an act of impatience, a moment where human reasoning tried to override divine timing. And Abram, instead of seeking God's guidance, agreed. Hagar, Sarai's Egyptian servant, became pregnant. And immediately, the consequences of this decision began to unfold. Once Hagar realized she was with child, her attitude toward Sarai changed. She no longer saw herself as merely a servant. She had now given Abraham something Sarai could not. The shift in status created tension, and Sarai, filled with bitterness and regret, lashed out. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me." Genesis 16 verse 5. What had once seemed like a logical solution had now become a source of pain. Sarai had tried to control the situation, but instead, she had created conflict and division. In frustration, she mistreated Hagar so harshly that the pregnant servant fled into the wilderness. Alone, afraid, and vulnerable, Hagar found herself by a spring of water, uncertain of what lay ahead. But God had not abandoned her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert, Genesis 16 verse 7. This was a moment of divine intervention. Hagar, an Egyptian servant with no status, was seen by God. He called her by name, asking where she had come from and where she was going. She poured out her heart, and in response, God spoke words of comfort and promise. "Go back to your mistress and submit to her. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." Genesis 16 verse 9 to 10. And then God revealed something astonishing. Hagar's son, whom she was to name Ishmael, meaning God hears, would also become the father of a great nation. Though this child was not the promised heir of the covenant, he was still seen and blessed by God. Overwhelmed, Hagar responded with a name for God, one of the most profound declarations in Scripture. "You are the God who sees me," Genesis 16 verse 13. She had felt abandoned, cast aside, and forgotten, but God had seen her in the wilderness. With new strength, she returned to Sarai, and in time, she gave birth to Ishmael. For 13 years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son. Perhaps Abraham thought that this was the fulfillment of God's promise. Perhaps he believed that Ishmael was the heir through whom the great nation would come. But God had other plans. The true heir, the child of promise, had yet to be born. The story of Ishmael is a powerful reminder of what happens when impatience leads us to take matters into our own hands. Human plans may seem logical, but when they are not aligned with God's timing, they bring complications and consequences. Sarai and Abraham's attempt to force the promise created years of strife, division, and tension that would extend for generations. Yet, even in human failure, God's mercy remained. He did not abandon Hagar. He did not curse Ishmael. Instead, he saw them, provided for them, and gave them a future. But the ultimate promise, the covenant child, was still to come. And when God's perfect timing arrived, it would change everything. A new name, a new destiny. 13 years had passed since the birth of Ishmael. Abraham was now 99 years old, and Sarai was well beyond the age of childbearing. The promise of God had not been forgotten, but its fulfillment seemed impossible from a human perspective. It had been decades since God first called Abraham out of Ur, and though he had seen blessings and provision, he had yet to see the central promise come to pass, the birth of an heir through whom a great nation would emerge. Then, when all hope seemed lost, God appeared to Abraham again. "I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you, and will greatly increase your numbers." Genesis 17 verse 1 to 2. There was a new urgency in God's words. This was not just a reminder of the promise. It was a reaffirmation, a call to deeper faithfulness, and a sign that the time was near. Abraham, overwhelmed by the presence of God, fell face down in reverence. And then, in that moment of surrender, everything changed. God spoke, and with his words, he reshaped Abram's very identity. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. Genesis 17, verse 5. Abram, which meant exalted father, was now Abraham, meaning father of many. It was a name that carried the weight of divine destiny. Though he had only one son, though Sarai was barren, though logic said otherwise, God declared that he was already the father of nations. His identity was no longer defined by his circumstances, but by the promise of God. But Abraham was not the only one who received a new name. God also said to Abraham, "As for Sarai your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she will be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her." Genesis 17, verse 15 to 16. Sarai's name was also changed. She would now be called Sarah, meaning princess or noble woman. She was not just the wife of Abraham. She was the matriarch of kings, the mother of a chosen people. Though she had laughed at the idea of bearing a child in her old age, God had spoken, and his words carried the power of transformation. At these words, Abraham himself laughed, not out of disbelief, but out of amazement. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? Genesis 17, verse 17. From a human standpoint, it was absurd. A child at their age? It defied every natural law. Yet, God's promises are not bound by human limitations. And to ensure that the promise was clear, God gave them the name of their future son, Isaac, which means he laughs. It was a reminder that what seemed impossible to man was a cause for divine joy. Then, as a sign of this covenant, God commanded Abraham and all the males in his household to be circumcised. This physical mark would be an everlasting sign of the promise, a seal of the faith that defined Abraham's relationship with God. It was a call to set himself apart, to walk in obedience, and to live in the reality of the covenant. This moment marked a turning point. No longer was Abraham simply waiting for God's promise. He was stepping into his divine destiny. He was no longer just an aging man wondering if he had misunderstood God's words. He was now Abraham, the father of nations, walking in the certainty of God's faithfulness. But even with this renewed covenant, one final test of faith remained. God had promised that Sarah would bear a son, but Sarah herself had yet to believe it. And soon, divine messengers would arrive, bringing news that would challenge her doubts and reveal the power of God's perfect timing. Laughter and the impossible, the birth of Isaac. The days passed, and Abraham and Sarah continued their journey of faith. They had received their new names, a sign that God's promise was not just a distant hope, but a reality unfolding before them. Yet Sarah, despite hearing the words of God, still struggled to believe. She had lived nearly a century without bearing a child. The thought of carrying a baby, nursing him in her old age, and raising him seemed too far-fetched to grasp. Then, one day, 3 strangers arrived at their camp. Abraham, seated at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day, saw them approaching. Without hesitation, he ran to meet them, bowing low to the ground as a sign of hospitality. "My Lord," he said, "if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed and then go on your way." Genesis 18, verse 3 to 5. The visitors agreed, and Abraham hurried to prepare a feast. He instructed Sarah to bake fresh bread, selected a tender calf for the meal, and ensured that his guests were well cared for. But these were no ordinary travelers. As they ate, they spoke words that would change everything. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked. "There in the tent," Abraham replied. Then one of them, the Lord himself, delivered the long-awaited news. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Genesis 18 verse 10. Inside the tent, Sarah was listening. At these words she laughed. It was not the laughter of joy, but of disbelief. The very thought of a 90-year-old woman bearing a child seemed ridiculous. She turned the idea over in her mind, her years of barrenness whispering louder than the promise, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Genesis 18 verse 12. But God, who hears even the thoughts of the heart, responded. Why did Sarah laugh and say, "Will I really have a child, now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Genesis 18 verse 13 to 14. Sarah, suddenly aware that she had been caught in her doubt, tried to deny it. "I did not laugh," she said. But the Lord simply replied, "Yes, you did laugh." Though Sarah's faith wavered, God's promise remained unshaken. He had spoken, and his words would come to pass. Months passed, and in time, Sarah's body began to change. The impossible was happening. She was with child. The old woman, once barren and broken-hearted, now carried life within her. The evidence of God's faithfulness grew with each passing day until, at last, the moment arrived. Now, the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Genesis 21 verse 1 to 2. A child's cry filled the tent, and laughter, true, uncontainable joy, erupted from Sarah's lips. She held her son in her arms, and the name given to him by God was spoken for the first time. Isaac, meaning, he laughs. God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me, Sarah declared. Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Genesis 21 verse 6 to 7. The years of waiting, the doubts, the struggles, it had all led to this. God had fulfilled his promise, proving that nothing was too hard for him. Sarah's laughter, once born out of disbelief, was now a testimony of God's power. Isaac was more than just a child to Abraham and Sarah. He was the embodiment of God's faithfulness. He was the first step in the fulfillment of the covenant, the beginning of the great nation that God had promised. Through Isaac, the story of Israel would unfold, and through his lineage, the world would one day receive the greatest promise of all, the Messiah. The ultimate test, sacrificing the promise. Isaac had grown into a young boy, and Abraham and Sarah's home was filled with the sounds of laughter. The very name of their son, "He laughs," was a daily reminder of God's faithfulness. Every time Abraham looked at his son, he saw the fulfillment of God's promise, the living proof that nothing was impossible for the Lord. But then, one day, everything changed. God came to Abraham with a command that shook the very foundation of his faith. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. I will show you." Genesis 22 verse 2. It was a test unlike any Abraham had faced before. Isaac was not just his son. He was the child of promise. Through Isaac, God had sworn to make a great nation. And now that very promise seemed to be taken away. The weight of this request must have been crushing. Abraham had waited decades for this child. He had seen God perform the impossible to bring Isaac into the world. And now God was asking him to give him up. But Abraham did not argue. He did not plead or question. The same faith that had led him from Ur, the same trust that had sustained him through years of waiting, now carried him forward. He did not understand, but he obeyed. Early the next morning, Abraham prepared for the journey. He saddled his donkey, gathered 2 servants, and with Isaac by his side, set off toward the place God had shown him. For 3 days they traveled, the weight of the command pressing down on Abraham with each step. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the mountain in the distance. Turning to his servants, he said something extraordinary. "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Genesis 22 verse 5. These words reveal the depth of Abraham's faith. He did not know how, but he believed that somehow God would provide. He knew that God had promised descendants through Isaac. And even if it meant raising Isaac from the dead, Abraham trusted that God's word would not fail. Together, father and son ascended the mountain. Isaac carried the wood for the offering on his back, and Abraham carried the fire and the knife. As they climbed, Isaac, unaware of what lay ahead, turned to his father. "Father," he said. "Yes, my son?" Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Genesis 22 verse 7. Abraham's answer was simple, yet profound. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Genesis 22 verse 8. They reached the place God had chosen, and Abraham built an altar. He arranged the wood and then, with trembling hands, bound Isaac and laid him on top. At this moment, Isaac could have resisted. He was young and strong enough to fight back, but he did not. He submitted to his father's will, just as Abraham submitted to God's. Isaac, like his father, displayed an unwavering trust in the divine plan. Abraham raised the knife. His heart must have been breaking, his mind filled with questions. But his faith did not waver, and then. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham! Abraham!" Abraham stopped. "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Genesis 22 verse 12. At that moment, Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. God had provided. The sacrifice was there. Abraham untied Isaac and took the ram, offering it as a burnt sacrifice in place of his son. He named that place Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide. And then God reaffirmed his covenant. "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore." Genesis 22 verse 16 to 17. This moment was more than just a test of faith. It was a foreshadowing of something far greater. Thousands of years later, on another hill not far from this one, another father would offer his son. Just as Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice, Jesus Christ carried the cross. Just as Isaac was willing to lay down his life in obedience, Jesus willingly laid down his life for the sins of the world. But this time, there would be no ram in the thicket. There would be no substitute. Abraham's test pointed forward to this moment, the greatest act of love in history. God did not demand from Abraham what he himself was not willing to do. He did not withhold his own son, but gave him freely, so that through him all nations would be blessed. Abraham and Isaac descended the mountain together, a father and son restored. But the message of this moment echoed far beyond them. It was a lesson in faith, a lesson in trust, and a glimpse into the heart of God's redemptive plan. The legacy of a father, Abraham's lasting impact. Abraham's journey, marked by faith, obedience, and divine promise, did not end with him. His legacy stretched far beyond his lifetime, shaping the course of history and influencing the spiritual foundations of three major world religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The man who once wandered the land as a foreigner became the father of nations, just as God had promised. His descendants multiplied, his name endured, and his faith became the gold standard for all who seek to trust in God's promises. Abraham lived to see Isaac grow into a man, and before he died at the age of 175, he had the joy of witnessing God's faithfulness continue through his family. Isaac, the son of promise, carried the covenant forward, and from his lineage came Jacob, later named Israel, the father of the 12 tribes that would become the nation of Israel. From this nation, centuries later, would come the Messiah, Jesus Christ, through whom the ultimate promise of blessing to all nations would be fulfilled. God had told Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Genesis 12, verse 2-3. This promise was not just about physical descendants, but about a spiritual inheritance. Through Isaac came the Jewish people, who would carry the covenant and receive the law through Moses. Through them, the prophets arose, speaking God's words and preparing the way for the Messiah. And in the fullness of time, Jesus, the Son of God, was born from Abraham's lineage, fulfilling the promise that through him, all nations would be blessed. For Christians, Abraham is seen as the father of faith, not just in the sense of genealogy, but in his example of trust in God. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, wrote that Abraham's righteousness was credited to him because of his faith, not because of his works. His belief in God's promise, even when all circumstances seemed impossible, became the model of faith that transcended the old covenant and pointed toward salvation through faith in Christ. For Jews, Abraham is the patriarch, the one through whom God established his covenant with Israel. His life represents God's calling, his promises, and the foundation of a chosen people, set apart for a divine purpose. The land, the people, and the covenant all trace their roots back to Abraham, making him central to Jewish identity and faith. Beyond religion, Abraham's story is one of profound human struggle and divine faithfulness. He was not a perfect man. He doubted, he feared, and he made mistakes. Yet, despite his failures, God remained faithful to him. His life teaches that faith is not about having all the answers, but about trusting in the one who holds the answers. It is about walking forward even when the path is unclear, believing that God's promises will come to pass in his perfect timing. His legacy is not just found in his descendants, but in the millions of people throughout history who have looked to his story for inspiration. Whether through his unwavering obedience, his willingness to sacrifice, or his trust in God's promises, Abraham remains a symbol of faith that endures through the ages. His journey reminds us that God's plans are greater than our understanding. His timing is perfect, and his promises never fail. If this video inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Let's continue learning and growing in faith together. Also, share this video with your friends and family so that more people can discover the powerful story of Abraham and the lessons it holds for us today. Thank you for watching, and may your faith continue to grow, just as Abraham's did.